Defining Duke, an Xbox podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support the show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia. Salutations, everybody. It is Maddie here today, and welcome to Defining Duke Ultimate episode 96, a Defining Duke supplement. Today, I'm joined by two equally tired gentlemen today. We'll start off with, as always, my co-host, Lord Cognito. Cog, how are you doing on this fine Monday? It's November 28th. The time's ticking. We're getting close to the end of the year here. Get some time off.
I need it, brother. It's the post-Thanksgiving hangover. Yes. And then what it is like you get a couple of days off and you start to get into that pocket of just relaxation and how it used to be when you had time. Mm-hmm. And then you get thrown right back in the mix. And I'm like, I'm not ready to ramp up just yet. I was liking where I was last week. So that's where I am mentally. But obviously some major stuff happened. And we had to get the man himself, Hoeg Law, in the building.
Of course. Hoeg, you're probably more tired than both of us combined. I mean, you tried to get some time off, and then, well, Politico decided to drop a bombshell last week, just before Thanksgiving. It was Wednesday night, late Wednesday night. So, how are you feeling, my friend?
I'm doing okay. I like getting all this information. We can talk about who's leaking what and why, certainly. But yeah, it was that kind of thing. I don't take a lot of breaks off from doing this, from streaming a lot. I'm streaming 8 to 10 episodes a week, and so I was taking off the days before Thanksgiving. I was just gonna say, you know what, we're just gonna leave. YouTube's gonna hate it. That's fine. We're gonna press on. And then Sony and Microsoft, I think combined, put out like 140 pages of material on the Wednesday. Then the Politico article, then the Bloomberg article, another article today. And you keep up as best you can. But I have a lot of people asking me for my opinion, which I cannot complain about. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I have to interject really quick. I actually watched the entire 3-hour stream and was thoroughly entertained. Like, you are hilarious. I was like, this man made reading legal documentation very entertaining. So salute to you. I know, ILP knows about the marathon, so I can respect. That is a skill, sir.
I appreciate it. Yes. Certainly sometimes it feels like a skill, a curse. It's hard to say. That one in particular, people are like, why aren't you doing the Microsoft document? It's like, because they didn't edit. They got 111 pages. It took me 3 hours to go through Sony's 17 pages of content. I got to figure out how for them to edit or for me to edit to get that into any kind of YouTube form, or else my throat is going to die hours before we get to the end of that document.
We appreciate your hustle. And of course, for those who listen to DD, you all know that I did a brief pickup for about 15 to 20 minutes on the Politico article, because Colin was the one who dropped it in our Patreon or our Discord server. And I was like, okay, we got to record a pickup for this one right away. It was pretty raw takes, raw opinions. But we want to make sure we got Hoeg on to kind of get the more official stance on things. Is there room for panic? Is there reason for panic? And I feel like, based off your videos, there probably shouldn't be, but we're going to, as we've done historically, run through these and just share some thoughts on what's going on with, starting off with Politico, really. So they were the one who, I think, broke this story wide open, where they posted an article titled, "Fed's Likely to Challenge Microsoft's $69 billion Activision Takeover." And to my knowledge, this is really the first kind of activity we've heard about the FTC in this whole entire situation involving Activision and Microsoft, where we've talked a lot about the CMA, for example, the EU, but I feel like this is the first time we're really seeing the FTC get involved. And I remember in our one-on-one conversation last time, Rick, you said they kind of are the leaders in this one, right? So what they say goes effectively. And to make a long article short, the article has suggested that there would be a lawsuit of sorts, an antitrust lawsuit that would inevitably block the Microsoft $69 billion takeover of Activision Blizzard. And the way they framed it towards the end of the article was pretty much saying that it would be a time thing. So the deal has to be done by July, and that if they were to submit some form of lawsuit, that a conversation would not finish by then. So I want to leave the very generalized take of the article there, because we could sift through it all day. as I'm sure you already have. But Hoeg, where do you want to begin with this? Do we begin with the panic levels and do we calm down the masses, or do you want to get into what's actually happening in Politico? Like, was it clickbait perhaps that got everyone riled up?
Yeah, let's talk about it all kind of 30,000 feet, right? Like top level before we get into details. Number one, I would not characterize this as clickbait, right? To me, clickbait is like completely separate from what you even pretend is the contents of the box. Right, this is a J.J. Abrams type special. There's a great thing in the box. There's nothing in the box. That's clickbait. This is more like there's definitely something there. They actually cite 3 individuals at the FTC. They're anonymous. So as I say in virtual legality, you got to take it with a grain of salt. We don't know where their tilt's coming from. It seems like the only people who could have this information are actual folks, personnel at the Federal Trade Commission. So that seems like an all right speculation for this. And then we can get into why is that information coming out? Why does it come out in like 2 or 3 separate articles at once? That kind of questioning. I think here likely, I'm not sure I would report it differently, but likely is probably a bit too strong because the actual sourcing in the document is that there are 3 anonymous people at the federal, well, what we think is at the Federal Trade Commission, because I can't imagine where else this would be sourced. And they are saying that they are likely to bring a lawsuit. And without knowing more, we don't know whether they're talking to a director, a commissioner, staff members, whether it's a controlled leak, whether it's actually people going against their commission and they're trying to press their own commission to do something. We just don't know any of the tilts and biases here that can happen. And unfortunately, even though we're in gaming and we're talking about things that are, sorry, gamers, I love you, I love video gaming, not the most important thing in the world, as opposed to other things that would get leaked to Politico or Washington Post or whatever.
The replies on the tweet with that article were hilarious. Like tons of people go, who cares? It's video games. I'm like, damn, this is reaching the masses now.
Well, yeah. Well, you've got those articles because you got the New York Times article, which is like a couple of days before that, I think was the really big deal.
Yes.
That was when it was really mass. And then you got that last paragraph in that article that says the FTC is putting lawyers together. And that was the first time I told people, okay, that's not that unusual. So there's basically 3 outcomes that can happen in an antitrust look like this one. And it's they can just let the deal go through. They can ask for concessions. They can sue to block. And I've said this a couple of times in a couple of places, but the most important thing to understand on this is that the FTC is just another actor in this kind of drama, right? If we're thinking about it as a TV show, the FTC gets to say, we're taking you down, we're stopping the deal, but they aren't the final deciders on that. That actually has to go to the judiciary at some point if Microsoft wants to fight it. And so the Federal Trade Commission has those 3 options. But importantly, and this kind of gets skipped in the Politico article, this gets skipped in a bunch of different places. Importantly, if the Federal Trade Commission or the Department of Justice, those are the 2 bodies that look at these things in the United States, want to go and ask for concessions. You're probably familiar with the phrase concessions or the consent decree, you've heard me say, or just a settlement if you're more familiar with kind of criminal law and those kinds of things, plea bargain, whatever you want to call it. If you want to get to that level, and we're pretty sure all the regulators do at this point, just separating it out from the law for a second. If you want to get to that level, you want to ask Microsoft to do something for you. We want to make sure Call of Duty is on PlayStation for 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. We want to make sure Game Pass doesn't change in price to the negative of consumers for 3 years. Whatever you can imagine, whatever they're going to talk about, in order to get to the level where they ask for something from Microsoft, they first have to find that the deal untouched is anti-competitive, that it's illegal, that it's against the Clayton Act in terms of US law, against the other regulations in the UK and the EU. So they first have to find that there's a problem, because as I like to tell folks as a metaphor or an analogy, however you think about it, the police, law enforcement, which is what this is, they don't have power before they find an illegal act. And so they have to actually go find an illegal act here first. And what that looks like in practice is that you prepare a complaint. Looks like a lawsuit. Might be an administrative complaint, which is a little bit different. Might be a federal complaint, which is going and asking for a court to give you an injunction to stop the deal from going through until you go further. However it looks, if you intend to ask for concessions at the Federal Trade Commission level, you're going to be drafting a complaint. And so it's a little bit tough to unwind. Is this something they're going to file to try to block the deal, which is what we're hearing from Politico from these 3 people? Or is there movement at the company, at the regulatory body here that is seeing that they're prepping a legal team, they're prepping a lawsuit, they're prepping a complaint document, and is either wishing for that outcome, because there's going to be some motivated people of both sides probably at the Federal Trade Commission, and wishing for that outcome and linking it to the Politico? Or is there legitimate reason to believe they're planning to file and try to block the deal? And so the one thing I tried to communicate to everybody in both Twitter form, limited characters, difficult, talking about law, and
ain't that the truth?
form,
But Elon's apparently looking into 1,000 words now, so that could be fun.
I'll tell you what, I actually like having to kind of get, I don't need that adverb. I don't need that adverb. I'm repeating myself. I actually like that process a little bit. I think it makes me a better writer in other contexts.
Yeah.
I don't know if I want 1,000 words.
No, we don't want Reddit.
It's the beauty of Twitter anyway.
That's the one thing I wanted to communicate, was that the version of this that I have thought is most likely since Phil Spencer back in, I think, February, started saying, of course, we'd be willing to commit to Call of Duty on Sony, actually presenting the things that Microsoft would be okay conceding to, which has been happening now for 8 months, 9 months, 10 months. Once that happens, you're basically giving up the ghost. You're saying, okay, we're happy to talk about a consent decree. Now, at the same time, they're saying they're not happy to talk about a consent decree. We could talk about that in a separate video. But it looked for all the world, or at least looked to me, like they were prepping to give up things. And at that point, you're kind of giving up you just have to let this deal through. We're willing to agree to this. We're willing to agree to labor unions and recognize them at Activision. We're willing to agree to some kind of app store something, right? They come out with all that Coalition for App Fairness type stuff. And they've been doing that all year. So I just think that the outcome has been most likely deal goes through with concessions, which are called different things in different countries. That's why I use the word concessions. This consent decrees here, it's undertakings in the UK. I honestly don't know what they call the document in the EU. All the same kind of thing. That once you've kind of conceded that ground, then you're just kind of negotiating the price, right? What do you need? What are you asking for? I talk about swim lanes, which is that if you set the swim lanes in a manner where Microsoft was already heading in that direction, they don't care. They're fully willing to give concessions that they're already fine with. Microsoft is almost certainly fine keeping Call of Duty on PlayStation for like forever. And so they're like, oh, yes, no, please, not in the briar patch. We will happily give 10 years to Sony in these kinds of things. And I think that's what the conversation is at. And I think that's where we wind up. But I do think that there are certainly folks at the FTC that would be willing to sue over this. I think and I've said this a lot in virtual legality, I think it's a very weak kind of case. And historically, under antitrust jurisprudence, really wouldn't be seen as a big deal. Given Microsoft's position in video gaming in general as an overall market. But the other thing I did say in January is if you had motivated regulators, the one thing they could do is they could go and look at subscription services and cloud gaming. And that has proven to be the case. And I'm sorry if I gave the regulators the idea in January. I don't think I did. But those are the two markets that are really being focused on in all three of the major kind of problem jurisdictions. So I know that I said that's 30,000 feet, and I think I talked for 10 solid minutes. I have my own chat, you tell. But I'm happy to answer any other questions.
No, I have questions. Because obviously, I love the way you broke it down. There are some questions I have in reference to one, we're hearing about the FTC blocking deals like this similarly in the past. You talked about the Meta deal with, I believe it was Supernatural was the game in the fitness industry. Within, stepping in there. And again, this idea of if it does get blocked, this new and emerging market, right, that we don't know the future of yet, but potentially Microsoft could have advantages there, right? So with that logic, do you see a scenario where they could be extra aggressive to try to block that with that example?
100%. Yeah. When I saw the suit, and I keep calling him Facebook, I apologize, Lord Cognito. But when I saw the lawsuit of Meta and their attempted purchase of Within, I did make a video. And you want to talk about clickbait? I've gotten a little bit better at titling my videos on YouTube, but I said essentially the FTC has lost its mind. And one of the reasons I said that, and I said no deal is safe, I put on the thumbnail, right? I said, including Microsoft, because the actual justification they use to try to block that deal is it's only $400 million. Meta doesn't have a position in the dedicated VR fitness apps market. They acknowledge all these things. They could have. Meta could have invested in that instead of bought a company. They could have done these things. Them sitting out there not in the industry is more controlling of competition than them being in the industry. They have a whole series of hypotheses where I go, if that's antitrust, there's nothing the FTC can't try to block. The problem is for them is that the historical precedence of antitrust law. The actual judiciary, you have to go convince that there's a violation of the Clayton Act on this stuff, is not historically with them at all. So they have to present a novel argument on these things. And we haven't gotten far enough. They only sued within this fall, I think, maybe late summer. We haven't gotten far enough to see exactly where that's going to go, whether they're just trying to bully ball Meta into just dropping the thing, whether they're actually going to take it to the judiciary. At a $400 million acquisition, Meta may or may not care enough to fight it. When we talk about $70 billion, and more importantly, when we talk about $3 billion, which is where the timing is likely to wind up on this, it's between $2 and $3 billion that Microsoft would owe Activision if the deal is scuttled for a regulatory reason. Mm-hmm. What I say on my channel is that pays for a lot of lawyers. If you got $3 billion up for grabs, you can justify a lot of fight. And that was the idea. That's why it's structured that way. Activision can't control its own destiny here. They put themselves in limbo for years now, looking at that, especially if it goes into litigation. They want Microsoft to fight for this thing. And if Microsoft decides not to, they want to get paid. So Microsoft is going to have an incentive to fight for the deal. Now, I did also mention there's some weird math going on because the market has taken a tumble. And it's possible that the internals that they show for Activision are actually even more than $3 billion less than their purchase price offer. So you can get into really weird spaces if Microsoft wants to walk away from it and views the cost as essentially the cost of doing business. I don't think we have to go that far on this particular topic, but I do think you've pointed out exactly what you should be, Lord Cognito, which is that when you've got an FTC that's willing to sue over a deal like that, which is tiny in the grand scheme of things, in a market that is very thinly sliced. One of the things I say a lot is the antitrust laws, monopoly laws, however you want to think about them, they are almost always determined by how you frame the market, right? If you talk about VR apps, buying within doesn't make any sense. You talk about buying gaming, it doesn't make any sense that there's a monopoly there. You have to go and call it VR dedicated fitness apps to even try to find one. And then you find that Facebook isn't already in that market and you get them anyway. I say, well, the sky's the limit. what are you going to sue on? You can sue on anything that you want. And that's one of the big problems I have with that. I actually think that that's going to be a sure loser for them if Meta wants to fight it all the way. But on that same kind of theory, yeah, I'm not going to sit on my channel or anywhere else and promise you I can tell you what the FTC is going to do at any moment in time. That is their brain space. I can tell you I think it's a loser in court, certainly within. I think also for Microsoft Activision. But regulatory bodies bring losers all the time.
Right. Yeah, no, this is interesting. And, again, because of that mindset, I was thinking about with cloud and Azure and how they're in that space. And then, obviously, you talked about the three options, obviously accepting a deal, which at this point doesn't seem like it's going to happen.
I think that's the one thing you can be sure is out.
Yeah. Accept is out because we are in phase 2. We're going to go there. Concessions is a possibility. We see it feels like Microsoft is willing to vocalize, hey, on November 11th, we told Sony 10 years, look at us. We're doing the good thing here. We don't look at Minecraft, right? We want to give these examples that we're playing nice. That it essentially is going to be in perpetuity, right? So you have that. Then you have the block. And I think the block aspect is interesting to me because, again, like you said, the Activision aspect of it, I believe, Manny, if I'm not mistaken, one of the representatives from Activision just made a statement, right? In reference to, if you want to clarify, I wanted to get your feeling on that because I remember you talking about that. That was quite interesting to me. Should they have been doing that? I'm very curious about your thoughts on that.
You're talking about in the Politico article, right?
Well, it became in the Politico article. I think it was originally a tweet.
Yes.
I think it's two tweets.
I'll get it to you, Matt.
Yeah, Politico actually, I think, changed. Websites are terrible at saying when they update things. Can I just say that? As somebody that prepares headline episodes and does these things, it's like every single morning I get there and I was like, am I having a psychotic break? This paragraph wasn't there before, was it? And nobody puts update or anything anymore. They added those spokesman statements, which are essentially, this is absurd, and we'll take it to the mattresses from Activision. I was reminded immediately of Activision's response to the California lawsuit, which is just like their way of corporate messaging is just abject anger. And it's like
they don't like the challenge.
They have some thoughts about government regulatory bodies. I will tell you that about Activision. And so I don't think it matters. The one thing I've said in different spaces is like Activision can say that we're going to fight it all the way. I understand why Activision wants that money. They're getting a huge amount for their shareholders, probably more than the natural market would pay for them right now, even with Modern Warfare 2. And they're going to go fight for that. they're not the ones that are going to matter. I know they're going to be defendants on the deal. Like if the FTC tries to block it, it'll be a lawsuit from the Federal Trade Commission against Microsoft and Activision. Activision is not the one choosing its own destiny here. Microsoft gets to say, forget this and walk away, or they don't. And Activision can be like, no, we're definitely going for it. You can't make Microsoft, fight for the right to spend $70 billion. It's going to be up to them at the end of the day. So their statement, completely understandable, completely what you would expect from them. And so ultimately doesn't move the needle one way or the other.
Gotcha.
Maddie, we're seeing, I was just going to say, I want to do two things. Like I want to ask Hoeg a question, but Cog, you never got a chance to give your thoughts on it, I think, about it. And I gave mine. I know Hoeg gave his. So I want to make sure you can jump in after this. But I wanted to just talk to Hoeg real quickly about the concessions, because the latest report as of the time of recording this, and there's always, by the way, I should have said this at the top, it's a good chance that by the time this episode comes out, like our CMA, there's like 2 more comments. So just a heads up on all of that. But right now, the concession that's been reported is 10 years of Call of Duty plus more that they're willing to give up. And I know you and I have talked about that a lot, that like, yeah, they're probably not going to give up Call of Duty in perpetuity, but what would be that sweetener to the deal, if you will, that we don't know about? Because this is all centered around Call of Duty. And I know there's been concern expressed about cloud gaming, and perhaps Microsoft does have that monopoly there where there isn't really a super strong competitor in that space. And that's the part I've always said, like, you could take a look at, I feel, just from a bystander point of view, at least, just because I don't think there is a clear competitor. Like everything else feels slow, laggy, not of higher quality. And even as someone who's been using the Logitech G Cloud a ton, like just firing up a cloud game on there versus something like NVIDIA, it's just night and day. So that's a long way of posing the question to you, Hoeg, is what else could Microsoft relinquish to get this deal across the finish line beyond the Call of Duty, I should add?
Sure, we could talk about that. The one thing I would say is that we don't know everything on this, right? We know what's been leaked. We know what kind of some of the statements are to like places like the CMA. We've got press releases from the CMA and the European Commission kind of giving broad strokes to what they're looking at, what they're looking for, some adopting Sony's language, some not. Microsoft has been deeply invested in talking to these regulatory bodies for a long time now, right? That even the European Commission, which we saw them turn over documents to only a couple months ago, they were still almost certainly talking about pre-statement delivery kind of conversations. What are you going to need? What are you going to look for? That kind of thing. And so Microsoft's in the best position to know what they think an attractive sweetener would be. Clearly, the signals they've been getting from at least the European side of this is that the Call of Duty question matters a lot to them. I don't think that makes a ton of sense, but they can read the room and they can look at the regulators and say, all right, we're going to offer this 10 years. In fact, that's almost certainly why you saw it given as an official statement to the New York Times a week ago, was that they were already prepping for that. They wanted to show Sony effectively rejecting it, because everybody would have said that they accepted it if they had. So they wanted to show Sony was not playing ball, and they wanted to try to establish that Sony was whining a little bit and would never be happy. And so they put that out in the New York Times. We get the report here that I'll probably cover in Virtual Legality this week about Phil Spencer, Xbox, going and deliberately offering potential concessions. That's an unusual step to publicize.
Right.
And so you're starting to get what I would describe as a kind of controlled leak battle of public relations type stuff. And that's interesting. And I would always caution people to speculate too much on what we can and can't know from following those things. But I think you are starting to see corporate massaging all over the place. And so Phil offering 10 years makes sense. He prepped that in the New York Times. He knows better than I do exactly what the European Commission might be suggesting is strong enough. But it could be, we promise equal terms on access to Azure for the same 10 years. We promise that Game Pass isn't going to change in price for a period of time. The kinds of things that the regulator would be worried about as reflected by what Sony has said, right? Sony says the 10-year deal offered to them isn't good enough because of parity questions. To which I send out snide tweets about the Modern Warfare 2 exclusivity for Sony PlayStation goods.
Wait, hold on. Are you implying something, Hoeg, about practices that Sony currently puts into practice? Or that's what you're saying?
The problem I have with it is people call me whatever, and Xbox and these kinds of things. And it's like, I actually I don't have a problem with what Sony does with Modern Warfare 2 right now. I'm highlighting this not because I have an issue with these marketing contracts. I'm highlighting it because there's a sentence in their statement to the CMA that basically says anything that is unequal on the delivery of Modern Warfare, on the delivery of Call of Duty, cannot allow the gaming industry to stand. I mean, it's absolutely like over the top crazy.
Harmful.
It's not that I have a problem with what you're doing right now. I don't have a problem with 6 months for Final Fantasy 16. I have a problem with both sides of this, right? And so that's where I get kind of not upset exactly, but I'm at least humorously discussing what Sony has to say in their statements. And so I think when you look at this and you evaluate these kinds of things, if you can go and you can offer directly, all right, maybe you have to say, I don't think it matters because you're going to be putting it on Game Pass. Microsoft say, all right, fine. We said we're not going to deliver parity because we thought we could have the same bonus map or whatever the heck Sony pays money for right now when we spend $70 billion. We don't even need it. All right. So maybe they say, you know what? Fine, European Union. We will say absolute 1000% parity, except what I think Microsoft is going to jealously guard and would fight for in the lawsuit is that you're not going to mandate we put it on other subscription services.
That's what I was going to ask.
We get it on Game Pass. We're not putting it on anything else. They can have it for sale on their system. We will make sure it's available to PlayStation players. Game Pass isn't over there anyway. And so you can go and you can buy it. We're okay with that. But you're not going to tell us we can't put it on the business model that we built to fight you, to compete, which is what you care about. And you're going to try to cut the legs off of that through using government regulatory interaction. To me, I think that's a clear winner. European Union is a very interesting way to go about this because in general, before the FTC started rattling sabers or anything like that, I would have told you, and I suspect this was basically what Microsoft would have thought at the time, it was the European Commission, the European Union, that was going to be the toughest to get on your side. And so if they're presenting this publicly, I believe, and like I said, I have to do a little bit more analysis on this, a little bit more research, but I believe that they're looking at a situation where they actually think that they're more reasonable at the European Union on this than maybe their counterparts in Washington, D.C., which is a major turn in global political affairs on this, if that is in fact the case. But that would be an attempt to go and try to get regulators on your side and then kind of push back the leverage of the other regulators with somebody agreeing that you can get this done.
So much to unpack. Yeah, Maddie, to your initial question, Maddie, my thoughts. When the news broke, I think this was the first time that I felt the climate of gamers who were very pro Microsoft finalizing this acquisition. I think this is the first time they felt a pushback, like, whoa, wait a minute, right? There was a little fear in the room, like this thing could be blocked.
Fear turned to anger very quickly.
Very quickly, right? And you know, it was a little hostile out there. You know, people were very emotional about it, and you know,
shockingly so.
Shockingly so, right? You know what I'm saying? And so my thought process, I was like, okay, let me look at it. You know, it's saying likely, okay, 3 anonymous sources, okay, you know, it could happen, right? But my mindset was, okay, what has changed from that article to what we knew prior? And to me, if I looked at the totality, not much. So I was just like, okay, this could happen, right? But there's nothing saying like, it's definitively going to happen and it's no way it's getting across the finish line. And to me, I've always felt, my gut instinct has always felt that it's been about concessions, right? And I felt that Microsoft has been playing this very, as Hoeg mentioned, this very interesting political game where we're kind of telling you what we're willing to do. And Sony and the thing to me that's more interesting in all of this is when the November 11th date came out, and they said they offered the 10, Sony declined the comment. That to me immediately was a red flag that they're not accepting 10. So when I see that you're not willing to accept 10, then I got to assume you're going scorched earth with this. You're going block the deal at all costs. And I've been on record, man, as you know, with Jim Ryan's ascension at Sony. You know, whenever a lot of my, shout out to my Xbox fans, my Microsoft brothers, I get it. But I told people, watch him. And the reason being, he's a very shrewd businessman. He was able, his journey through Sony has been through the success of the EU. That's where he made his bones. That's the way his rise to ascension became, even to get the Japanese shift over to the EU. And to me, when you are in that position, I know this is a little bit of a speculation here, but when you're in that position, you make connections, you make relationships, you know people in the area. And I felt his influence would be very heavy to, even when he came out with the inadequate statement. Mm-hmm. I thought it was humorous, but I was like, for him to publicly put that out there, we know that does not look good optically. So you're willing to fight this, even though people are like, hey, Sony, what about this exclusive content you've been doing? Your whole business model is essentially exclusive content in walled garden and play where we want you to play at, right? And now you're playing, this is harmful. All gamers will be harmed if this happens, right? And to me, it denoted whatever this money is, whether it be 30% for Call of Duty just existing on PlayStation, this is serious business for them. Mm-hmm. And they are willing to go to war for this. So I say all that to say this, where we get here is, okay, they're willing to go to block it. And if they could nudge, I don't want to say bad words, but if they could influence, regulators who may not be educated in the space, right? We've already heard Phil Spencer had to go out there with a Switch.
Baby's first video game system. Yeah.
Like it was like a Fisher Price situation. Like, hey guys, this is how the ecosystem looks and works, right? Because we as hardcore gamers, we look at some of the stuff Sony's saying, it's laughable. Let's just be honest. Like, it's just like, really, like, how can you, of all people, say the things that you're saying about how obnoxious the deal is based on your own practices? And I'm not trying to get fanboyish. We just got to call it for what we see it based on the verbiage that they're using, right? So that's how I just internalized it, Matty. And I was just like, man, they are willing to go there with this. And I think it's the risk they're willing to take. The last point I'll say, and I think Hoeg, you may have commented on this on Twitter. I saw it.
Probably.
The last one I'll say is that I thought, which is interesting, because this is a high risks, high reward situation if they pull this off, right, with this block. But if they don't, I am actually concerned about all the relationships and bridges they may be burning, right? And maybe it's Biden, maybe it doesn't have effect. But I'm like, okay, if you say Battlefield. First of all, you're saying there's nothing we can do internally in our studios that can match Call of Duty. Nothing. No SOCOM, no. You make the greatest games arguably in gaming, but there's nothing you could do. Then you just bought Bungie for 10 years, right? Mm-hmm. And you basically said there's nothing they could do for live service to match that.
You talking about Bungie too, man. Like that's
my beloved Bungie, but okay. Right? You saying that, and then I think didn't Battlefield catch a stray? EA catch a stray?
God. It wasn't even a stray, it was a paragraph.
Like you see how failed they are when they were trying to attempt this.
Well, I think they caught a stray from me because I think I went over that paragraph and said, good Lord, thank God the industry isn't actually bound by the successes or failures of Electronic Arts. That's a ridiculous argument, Sony. EA fails at a lot of stuff.
But this is serious business, Hoeg. They are willing to go there regardless of the optics, regardless of how it looks, to influence these regulators. And I thought that
EA Play partnership just got extended a little bit with that. In one foul paragraph, that's all it took. And they're like, 5 more years, Microsoft? Okay.
Well, here's the bad news, Cog, because I think you're right, but I think people are asking the question a little wrongly, as if Sony winning this restores those relationships. I really think that there is a fracture happening, and I honestly think that even with some of the publishers who are mostly staying out of the line of fire, but also submitted responses we saw in Brazil, we see the CEO of Take-Two talking about this deal and be like, well, I don't know what is even happening right now. No, we don't care. It's going to open up more opportunities to the rest of the publishers. And having all of those people just watching this, we've got the comments from Ubisoft. We've got the comments from Bandai Namco. We've got the comments from, we got some from Electronic Arts. They might have new comments now after the recent Sony delivery to the CMA. We know that for the most part, the industry does not care about this deal except for Sony, which means if Sony can't win the console argument, which is what we see the CMA continuing to consider, and I think it's one of their weakest arguments, because there's no real way that you can see the console market collapsing because Call of Duty goes one way or the other. That if they can't make that case, they have no case that is separate. Sony is only separate from these other parties based on their sales of a hardware device. Otherwise, they're just a publisher of video games. And if everybody else doesn't care, they got a real hard road in terms of the actual industry participants. Now, antitrust law isn't just based on industry participants. God, thank you. Because if you just had Sony doing this stuff, it would be crazy enough. But they're going out there and they're fighting for this stuff. The arguments are specious. They're clearly both aggrandizing and centered. And to me, I'm a big Sony fan. I have trouble communicating this. And I did it in that 3-hour video we were talking about before the show, Cog. But it's like, man, I had a PlayStation on launch day in 95. I've had every PlayStation, I think, on every launch day.
I was nothing but a thought at that time.
There you go. There you go, man.
We showed our age.
Well, but I tell people, like, my favorite genre is like Japanese role-playing games and strategy games. It's like, where do you think I'm playing these?
PlayStation.
It's occasionally on Switch, but for the most part, I'm playing the PlayStation maybe 70% of the time of my video game hours. I have a great deal of fondness for the PlayStation brand. And to me...
How couldn't you? Come on now. Wearing the Sly Cooper shirt today.
I like that.
Like, bring back Sly Cooper, Sony, and then you'll get nicer videos from me. And I look at this and I'm just... I have a background in economics. I have a background in corporate law. I do mergers and acquisitions. It's like I got a lot of skin in this game in terms of following this. And I go, these arguments are crazy. This is my transactions. If I had somebody doing this on the other side of one of my transactions, I'd be like, good Lord, what is the deal? And no, continue, because I don't have a lot else to add in terms of substance on that particular point. It's just that I really do think these relationships are going to be burdened by this for a considerable amount of time, however it goes. And if Sony wins and locks it out, I have no idea what Activision does. Their shareholders will have lost billions. Their management will have lost years. And both are going to be disinclined to be too terribly besties with PlayStation. Right. And so I don't know where they think this ends. But it's remarkable to me. And I think Microsoft knew what they were doing. They were playing it in a very specific way. They were trying to address every constituent stakeholder's concerns. That's why you see the CWA agreement. You see them swap CWA from against to pro the deal. Microsoft had a plan, and I think it was a good one. They did not anticipate Sony acting as irrationally as they appear to be acting.
Yes, that was my question for you. That was literally because I was going to say, did they foresee this type of action from Sony? Because again, I would have to agree with you. Like, I can't see them thinking Sony would take it to this level, right? And then my follow-up question, which you kind of alluded to, which was like, I'm always on the side, even if I disagree with someone, I'm always on the side of trying to understand the mindset, understand the thinking, and trying to be fair and the devil's advocate for the most part. Mm-hmm. And my thing is, okay, what's the end game? So if you're Sony and you get this blocked, right? How does that relationship with Activision look moving forward? Then if you're Microsoft, now you have to pay that fee. We're going to assume you're willing to fight, right? You're willing to take this to and most likely, I mean, according to sources, and shout out, I know it's my man, like, he doesn't get a lot of love, but my man Pactic, he kind of agrees that, like, hey, like, he thinks it's an easy win for Microsoft with regulators.
We're talking on Twitter because
okay.
No, I said I agree with from the U.S. side of things. I can't.
Right.
I'm an American lawyer. I can't speak to the U.K. Court of Appeals. I can't speak to the EU and that kind of thing. From an American side, it's like, oh yeah, this looks like a pretty clean loser for them. And yeah, Michael Pachter is not a lawyer, so he's more animated in his position. There, it's like they never do this ever. It's likely that they take it to court and get stomped or whatever he said. And I said, I tend to agree with you. I don't make guarantees because there's no accounting for crazy. Right. Yes. There's no accounting for an FTC that just says, it ain't our money. Let's see what happens. And that can occur.
Yeah. I had a couple of questions, actually, because, like, let's say this does get halted. My mindset is Microsoft now has a lot of money to play with. If my understanding is correct, right? That most of
they will have earmarked $67 billion or so that they wouldn't have just spent. But they also would be chastened from acquisition. And we've seen historically they are chastened from exclusive contracts. Phil Spencer appears to have had a traumatic event with Rise of Tomb Raider. And he's referenced it a couple of times. And so I don't think Microsoft as a business model or plan wants to be in the business of temporary exclusives. They don't think they get the ROI for it. So I know that other people have posited that they would just spend this money and exclusivize the industry. It's a possibility. Again, I don't make guarantees.
Because I feel like the message there would be almost sent like, you can't play this game, but you can play PlayStation's game. That's why I posed the idea. But
yeah,
continue.
Certainly. So I think you see these differences in philosophies throughout, right? You see PlayStation say we can't justify the budget of a AAA game on our subscription service, which is amusing because they say Call of Duty would surely make a subscription service. I covered that all when I'm going over their statement. But they say that they have a difference in philosophy over how these subscription services should work. You see Microsoft have a difference in philosophy. You don't see them signing a bunch of exclusives. Certainly not temporary. Certainly not the partials, right? That you get a gun skin. You get this kind of thing. You don't really see them advocating for that as much. And they have a bundle of money. They could, and they might with $67 billion. We don't know what a Microsoft that has just been smacked in the nose and has $67 billion that was earmarked as gone is going to do. So I don't think anybody can actually say that. But I'm not sure it's just we're just going to adopt the Sony model, because I don't think they're convinced by the Sony model. And so I would hesitate to jump right into that. Because generally speaking, you have something like this happen and the company takes stock. It's an inflection point for them. Oh, well, we got out of that. What can $67 billion do for us today? And it might be, server infrastructure. It might be something out of gaming. Microsoft, big conglomerate. So we don't know what happens to that $67 billion necessarily. But I just don't see them copying the Sony model. That's just my opinion. It's all speculation on a future we can't see. I just don't see them going that road.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I understand where you're coming from on that. The other question I had was about this 10-year offer by Microsoft. And if again, I'm more so checking my understanding of the situation and then kind of letting you go off with it. Because let's say PlayStation says, no, we're not doing that. And like Cog said, they're going to go scorched earth. Is there a reality where the FTC or whatever regulatory body kind of goes, well, you fucked up. Like now they can do whatever they want. They don't owe you anything. Like, is there a reality where that happens, or would there just? I guess you've probably answered this before in just previous conversations we had, but I'm guessing there will be a concession in some way, shape, or form. But is there a reality where that doesn't happen because PlayStation kind of got hungry and was like, well, let's see if we can just shut this all down, and maybe the regulatory body saw through their actual desires, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think you heard Cog describe Sony's plan right now as high risk, high reward. And I think that's what you're really talking about on this is you have told the regulatory bodies loudly that if you lose Call of Duty access, you're donezo. The gaming industry has ended. It's the apocalypse right now. Dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. And if you then get a 10-year deal and you reject it, I think there at least has to be a notion at the regulatory body that says, what? What are you doing? This is 10 years
how bad do you actually need it then?
Yeah, 10 years isn't good enough for us. It's like, okay, so you don't think that you could come up with a substitute for this place in your library in 10 years of development time. Okay. And you're willing to not get a contract at all if we don't go with you. That's accurate too, Sony? Okay. We are not terribly convinced that it is an existential crisis as you suggest it is, if that's in fact the case. Now, a reasonable person can look at this and say, well, Microsoft's trying to trap us, right? That this 10-year deal isn't what we want anyway. We want Activision independent. That's why they kind of changed the tone of their most recent statement to the CMA. As Cog said in his answer already, it's like they have decided to go all out. And that was a surprise to me even now. Right. And I'm sitting here and people, thank God, are listening to me and unfortunately quoting me as more specific and guaranteeing of things that I would like. I don't know whether I should jump into those.
You pop up in my comments a lot now when the subject comes up. They're like, Hoeg said this.
They'd be like,
Hoeg said. I would say like maybe 60% of those are like what I said. And I'm always looking at the internet now being like, do I jump in and be like, nah, bro, I don't. Yeah. It's all right. Let's do this together. But when you look at a deal like this, I think that the overall thing that Microsoft is trying to accomplish with the FTC is to get the deal through, and Sony is risking everything to try to get that deal through. Now, I think that answer changes a little bit based on what we've seen from at least the leaks from Reuters today. which is that they are going to continue. Microsoft is tried for months, and you don't have to believe this, dear viewer or listener, as an actual truth. But Microsoft has tried to paint itself up in glittery gold and silver as the white knight riding in on the horse. We're against those Googles and Apples that you are against, dear regulator. And we are for all the things you are for as well. Love us. We're going to take things in the right direction. And they've done that for like 10 months. So I think by not taking advantage of what is a leverage point, right? I think you're both correctly calling it out. Sony gives that up. They could go to the European Commission and say, how serious are they really? And at least from what's leaked is like, you know what? Let's not worry about them. They're throwing a tantrum. They're unhappy. We're going to still offer you the 10 years as the concession. We can make sure it does right by Sony. Let's just be the adults in the room. We'll take care of Jim. Okay? We'll take care of him.
I'm a petulant child.
And I think that's how they're presenting themselves, right? Like that's still the method that they have decided to use. Every single step of this is, how am I going to present myself? And if they're just saying, we're not even going to reduce the offer, all right, they could easily reduce the offer. Say, look, we tried. I had said before we heard about the 10-year offer that I thought 7 was probably a decent number for a regulator to come up with, because it's the average of a generation length. So you got a generation to go figure out what to do about this, Sony. And that's enough. That's enough time. They say, we're going to offer 10. We're also going to tell the European Union 10. Make us do 10. We'll do 10. And to me, unless the regulators want to actually try to block this thing, and they got problems with that up and down the regulatory regimes, then it again looks like Phil Spencer, Satya Nadella, and Microsoft, who a lot of regulators are rightly fearful of, giant corporation, look again like the bigger actor to me from the outside. And that's what they've tried to do for a while now. It's not a guaranteed success, but I think it's a very smart political and savvy strategic move for the whole year now. They got people on their side, not just console warriors, which, love them, but that's not really my bag. Not just console warriors looking at it and saying, Microsoft, this giant megalith of a corporation, is, being the good guys. And Sony, the leader in that clubhouse of video games, are making all sorts of nonsensical arguments. And the fact that you can be Microsoft, you can have $70 billion in couch money to just go throw at companies, and you could still have at least somebody saying, you're looking okay, is interesting. So that's where I see it.
Yeah, this is real interesting, man. Some points that I thought they were interesting from Sony in there was that, they kind of said Microsoft had this history of kind of like dominating, the industry as far as publishers taking over companies, doing kind of nefarious things, and part of their reasoning. And then it kind of led me back to the whole Game Pass PSN parody stuff. And I thought it was interesting that, Microsoft kind of said, hey, we were willing to give them Game Pass on there, but they rejected. And then Sony countered. It was like, well, we were willing to give you PlayStation Plus, and you rejected. So it's this cat and mouse of, who's has the moral high ground. It's hilarious. Like, what do you think about that? Them specifically with those statements in terms of subscription services and being on the other platform?
This to me is Microsoft's maybe most specious argument. And again, specious, just because I only talk in legalese, hollow, empty kind of argument. It doesn't make a lot of rational sense to me. Microsoft would say here, well, we offered them Game Pass. They can get the games on Game Pass through Game Pass on their system. And my response is that's a rival branded opportunity for your major rival in your upstream video game console sales and bringing people in to your ecosystem. And it cannot be the case that to avail yourselves of antitrust protection, you have to accept the offer to have somebody else on your system that's selling things against you. It can't be that for you to find that the local, I don't know, who can I use that I won't offend? The local Circuit City is engaging in antitrust activities. Best Buy has to put the Circuit City subscription service on the shelves in their store. So to me, it's kind of an okay logic exercise, primarily for public relations. We offered them Game Pass, but as a legal matter, it can't be that Sony is required to accept that, or else they can't get antitrust protection. So I think it's a bad argument on its kind of fundamentals. And so I would kick all of that to the side. If I'm a commissioner at the FTC, or if I'm somebody else looking at this and be like, oh, okay, kids, that's all going over here. It doesn't do anything of merit on that. So yes, you offered Game Pass. Sony said no. Very surprising that they didn't want to help you advantage yourself over them. And so we have to look at this separate from that. So I don't think it's a very useful argument long term. That's a legal kind of position.
But the last point, Matty, I'll give it right back to you.
No. I'm out of questions actually. So
okay,
you're good.
Okay, because my thing was, in my opinion, Sony keeps referencing Game Pass, and I think it's rightfully so, because I mean, effectively, if Call of Duty goes into Game Pass, even if it remains on PlayStation, it does devalue even though they have it still. I'm not saying it's going to, like Sony say, have a whole mass exodus of PlayStation fans coming over to Xbox, but it does devalue their version of it, even though they'll have parity and feature. So I guess my question is, I don't think there's any scenario that Microsoft accepts it not being in Game Pass, but I feel that's one of the sticking points for Sony. They look at that as a serious threat to their ecosystem.
Yeah, but the question there is always what's at the foundation of this, which is, absolutely. Microsoft's spending $70 billion to bring some PlayStation over, to win market share, to maybe take over the leadership position. Are they allowed? Right? So you say devalued. I would say their value hasn't changed. It's only comparative, right? They got a $70 Modern Warfare 2. They get a $70 Vanguard 2. Yeah, there's definitely a Vanguard 2 coming. Mm-hmm. And so you'll get that on the PlayStation. You could get it for free on Game Pass, which will be going up in price after the Activision deal. And you get a better value for your Call of Duty buck. But nothing has really changed in the Sony ecosystem. It's just, at least from afar, that's just Microsoft competing with Sony. Now you can start getting into economic arguments about cash flow and predatory pricing and whether Game Pass can sustain itself. And I think, honestly, those are the more interesting ways that a regulator could go here. But we haven't really seen that yet. The only real document that is close to talking about that is the CMA's Phase 1 report. And that, to me, is the most interesting way to fight this, that Game Pass isn't real, that a regulator could go and look at the internal financials and do these things and say, it's subsidized. You won't talk about the revenue separately. We probably have access to more information. Doesn't look like Game Pass can sustain itself for X, Y, or Z reasons. These are all hypotheticals, Xbox fans. I'm not telling you anything right now. I don't have access to these materials. But if a regulator wanted to go and say, well, look, it's just predatory against Sony, that predatory pricing as an antitrust concept is that you take a big company, you spend all this money to essentially take over the market that is not supported by your actual market activities. The other people leave the market, and then you get to the price that things need to be at, that you could potentially make the argument there if some of the Game Pass stuff doesn't line up in the background. No regulator has actually gone that deep so far. They've just said Game Pass, pretty popular. We think subscription services might be a separate market. They're going to look at whether it's a separate market, because if it's not a separate market to gaming overall, basically there's no antitrust case at all. And so they have to go find that it's a separate market. I think that is a false statement. I think that Game Pass and subscription services in general are a substitute for buy to play, and that they are both gaming and that they are the same market. And I think they'd ultimately win in court on that if it came to it. But I do think Sony, what happened here, as far as I can tell, and I'm not going to, again, corporate lawyer is going to have a certain amount of sympathy for the corporations making these kinds of arguments. I think what Sony saw was that they were getting some traction with the CMA, maybe getting some traction with the European Commission. Maybe they think they're getting traction in Washington with the FTC. FTC a little bit more closed-lipped about these things, but not necessarily in back rooms. And so they adopted what those bodies cared about, right? The actual Sony statement is just a regurgitation. And I did my voice for virtual legality, but it's like, oh, you're so smart, CMA. I can't believe how smart you are on all this stuff. And it's just Sony being like, yeah, this is the right direction. You are thinking this through. You know what? Some people think you guys are dumb, but not us. You guys are super smart. And that's what they go through. They go through the line of items that the CMA has in particular, and they say, you're exactly right on that. You're exactly right on that. And yeah, the CMA adopted Sony's positions to begin with, but they're kind of rebounding on it, regurgitating it, and then doubling up on it. The real big move to me in that document that I wasn't expecting, the reason I did a video at all, was that notion at the end where they say, essentially, no sale of Activision can stand. Activision needs to be independent. It's not asking for concessions at that point. It's like you need to block it. And that is way further than I think even Sony might have thought that they were going in the middle of the year. And I think Microsoft almost certainly game planned for every outcome, but I think this would have been seen as a very low percentage chance that Sony would just settle the whole thing.
No, great point. And a final one. I completely agree with your mindset in reference to the spirit of competition. The way I look at it is, they are the leader in the space, right? And if you want to consider Xbox, second, third, what have you, if to me, my mindset is if you purchase something, then you, for the most part, get the chance to do what you want. Now, we understand Call of Duty is its own entity. It's way big. We get that. And that part I do understand. Well, okay, we need to control that. And I do understand the emergence argument self with cloud. I get that. The thing, though, to me, which I felt Brazil excellently stated that I'm not seeing here, is Nintendo's role here. Because Nintendo has shown they can exist without Call of Duty and for the most part dominate with the Nintendo Switch. And I just find it interesting, the classification of Nintendo in, the CMA with the European regulators. That part to me, it's almost like, no, that's kid stuff. That's what they do is something else, as if this is not gaming and they don't represent part of the pie. I find that preposterous to me. But what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so this is where I really think the CMA winds up irritating a lot of people, because that to me is exactly what you see when you see kind of bad statisticians or bad political arguments or anything that you want to frame as bad. Basically, every Chief John Roberts opinion. We're getting a little political here. And it's that it looks backwards, right? So Nintendo is an inconvenient data point for the argument that Xbox could take over with this. And so you just discard it. And you discard it on frameworks that you've already said don't apply. Most predominantly, the CMA goes out there and says we can't divide markets by genre, because that would be silly. That would be saying that you have a monopoly on action movies or a monopoly on puzzle games or a monopoly on any of these things. We don't use genre to define markets on these things because genres are generally substitutes for each other. Sometimes I feel like a rom-com. Sometimes I feel like a murder romp. Either way, depends on my day, depends on my state of mind. So we don't divide by genres. And then yet, the only way you can take Nintendo out of the equation is by genre. Is you say, well, they're only family gaming. They're not really even in the same kind of thing, or they're not competing on power. Well, yeah, of course, they're not competing on power. I'll tell you what, Microsoft didn't compete on power a couple generations either. And that's how these things go. They strapped a Kinect in and said, it'll cover for the power, don't you worry. They changed their course. They changed their mind on that. And that's what the market is supposed to do. You bounce around, you figure out what people actually want. Nintendo, portable, also docked, family friendly. People wanted that. It has a chipset from 14 years ago or something. People wanted it.
Shout out to Integra, still out here pumping.
So while Hoeg desperately searches for a Switch Pro, a Super Switch, would love one, hit me up, Nintendo. I'm ready to buy 3. They are competing in the marketplace. As I described it, it's like you go into the Target, you got the Switch, you got the Xbox, you got the PlayStation. They're all together. You're looking at all these at the same time, but they had an inconvenient data point. And I really do think it was a strong Brazilian argument. Sony comes back with this notion of like, and that's what they want of us. They want us to be Nintendo. It's like, I mean, there are worse things. Nintendo's a massively successful video game company. Maybe if you made some more Jack and Daxters and Sly Coopers, I'd like you better, Sony. I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I love that. I love hearing that. I'm glad someone else agrees.
Go get that stuff. Give me some platformers, Sony. You want to hit me with Knack 3, I'll accept it, but hit me with some Sly. And so you get this kind of weird argument. It's like Sony has a lot of conversation points that come off as entitled. And not like just the meme that you see on Twitter when someone wants to call you out, but like literally, this is our market share. We don't have to do what a competitor would make us do. We shouldn't have to go find other people to be our supporters. It's like, this is competition. This is competition. In an ideal world, they take Call of Duty from you and you come up with the most banger, awesome first-person military shooter I've ever seen. And now we got 2.
SOCOM.
Yeah, well, SOCOM had a lot of fun stuff. SOCOM was the first game I really enjoyed, like voice-activated commands on. They really had some
God. Yeah, I remember buying the headset for that, man.
Headset just for that feature, right, man? Yeah.
They had a lot of cool stuff with that. But, Sony, as you point out, as Microsoft points out in their statement, is real good at making video games. They could do it. I have faith in them. It's a pity they don't have faith in themselves, but that's all a put on, right? The one thing I repeat in that video is like, Sony doesn't believe this. Like, no reasonable person thinks that Sony believes half of this stuff in here. They just think it's useful to what is going to be presented here to these regulators. And nobody believes Sony is going to die. If Microsoft bought it tomorrow and took Call of Duty away, nobody believes Sony is leaving the industry or that they aren't going to find a way to compete with Microsoft. No one believes that. Not Jim Ryan, not Sony fans. And so it gets a little bit difficult from there because you do look at this, and I think one of your earlier questions, Cog, was, are the regulators just out of touch? Are they getting snowed by some of this stuff? And I think to some level they are. I think regulators of all stripes, good ones, understand that they aren't industry participants, understand that they can't substitute their judgment for the people that are actually in there. And so I don't know what's going to happen on this. I still think the deal goes through with concessions. I'll tell you that. But I have been surprised by a number of the things, the twists and turns of this story, but probably none more than Sony deciding to burn down what was a good decade plus of kind of comedy of like alignment of we're going to grow this industry. Gaming is good for all. We're going to stand on the stage at Game Awards together. And I think as someone who watches this story closely, I can't help but say that I still have goodwill for PlayStation, but it's diminishing. I don't have a lot of respect for some of these arguments, even as I understand why they're making them. If you think you can win on this, I kind of get it, but I don't have to like it while it happens.
Right. Yeah, respect. Yeah, it's interesting, man. We're gonna see how this thing plays out. Scorched earth thing. And to Maddie's point, as far as a scenario or a world where the deal does get blocked, another part of my curiosity would be kind of what you said, Maddie, which is, if Microsoft has 67 to play with, is the philosophy now, hey, you know what, we're gonna go attempt these practices, or will they be gun shy to buy a publisher because of these same regulatory bodies that would have to then approve them? Like, say if they wouldn't say, okay, we're going to get Sega, but now we may be gun shy, or is it just because of the fact this is 67 billion and that's why there's so much scrutiny and they won't be necessarily under that same scrutiny if they bought a Capcom, Square, or a Sega, or whomever? So,
yeah. Well, most recently, the regulators allowed the Zynga deal, no problem. So 12 is probably your cap where you can at least expect to complain logically about anybody giving you too hard of a time on that. Take-Two's a publisher, not a hardware producer. But yeah, I mean, if I'm spiteful, and generally speaking, I don't give legal advice, but practically businesses should not be run on spite. But if I'm spiteful, what's the market cap of Square Enix? It's going to be like 6 and change. Just give them 10. And say, yeah, all right.
We don't even know what to do with them. We wanted them.
We're not even sure we're going to have them make games. It's just 10 billion. Yeah. And Square Enix investors will be like, thank God that NFT thing probably wasn't going to work out. Yeah. And then Microsoft will just, make Final Fantasy 17 like Gears of War. You're like, okay, here we go, Microsoft. and all the great things everybody wants out of gaming. I don't know how this will go, but I do think Microsoft will continue to be focused on acquisitions. As a company, people don't necessarily realize this. As a company, they've been focused on acquisitions as their primary expansion model for decades. Yeah. Not in gaming. That's newish. That's a couple of years old. But they have, you could go and read, just go into the Wikipedia entry for Microsoft and just look up a year, whatever, acquisitions 1996, and you'll see 40. And they just acquire companies. It's what they do. And I wish I could promise anybody anything on this. I do think it's going to go through, but anybody that's guaranteeing you anything, whether it's Hoeg, Michael Pachter, Cog, Maddie, Colin, whoever, nobody has any idea. All right. Nobody has any idea. The FTC commissioners don't know what they're going to do at this moment in time. So don't take any prognosticative guarantees. That's my advice.
Yeah, no doubt. Absolutely. And Hoeg, your takes and your thoughts have, as always, been both entertaining and insightful. So we really appreciate you hopping on and giving us your all here on a very long Monday for you. So much appreciated. And where can
I love being here. Well, thank you for inviting me earlier. I'm sorry I had to miss it.
Oh, that's no problem. That's no problem. We knew we'd figure it out. It was just a matter of when. That was impromptu anyway. For those who don't know, I asked Hoeg, because it was very last minute. We were already talking at DMs. I'm like, are you free for like the main DD episode? Because I could just tag you in right now if you are. But it was super last minute before the holidays. I was not expecting it. So
I think I was at Light Fest. I think I was at Christmas lights. I was like, I can't make it now.
Oh, you were out on your phone to shoot this natty little text?
I was driving. I was like, oh man.
Yeah. I gave Cog the call, and I heard the Bluetooth, and I was like, he ain't showing up.
I was like, oh, I'm already driving to see the fam. I'm like, oh man. I was like, all right, baby, if you can get Hoeg to agree, maybe I could wiggle out of the family thing for a little bit and drive back. Say I'll be conveniently late.
On Monday instead. What's better?
Monday with more time and a little bit more things to reflect on. So
I'm always happy to come hang out with you gentlemen and talk video games.
I appreciate it. And of course, I imagine most of LSM is already familiar with you, but for those who don't know you, Hoeg, where can they find you?
Well, predominantly people can find me crowing about my undefeated Michigan Wolverines on Twitter. Woo! Probably a little bit more than people like, but otherwise, I think most people know me from a series of shows I do on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Hoeg Law, where almost every morning during the week, I'm doing Hangouts and Headlines, where we talk about fun news articles. We also hang out and talk about everything with a fun community of people at chat. So if you're up in the morning, I try to run it like a morning show with some energy and some fun, get you ready to go, 7:30 a.m. Eastern, which is real early if you're in California, so get excited. But also virtual legality, which I think is a bit more well-known. We just had our 4th anniversary of the channel yesterday, which was celebrating the first virtual legality 4 years ago, November 27th, going, of course, over Bethesda and whether or not you can get a refund for Fallout 76. And so we continue to talk about video games, business law, and more a lot of days. I can't promise every day, but a lot of days during the week. So please do check us out at the YouTube channel. And then Lawyers and Dragons, our Dungeons and Dragons role-playing with lawyers game, will be back at the top of 2023. We just finished season 1. So I just never stop streaming, folks.
Nice.
Love it, man. Good to see you. I just love how Hoeg is almost like a verb in the community. You know what I mean? Like he's at that point. It's so cool, man. Congrats, brother. I love to see what you're doing.
Having fun.
It makes me smile, man. You're doing your thing. And the knowledge and the insight is greatly appreciated. You do a tremendous service for the community and thoroughly entertaining my man Hoeg Law in the realm of the Dukes today.
Yeah. We need to come up for a term for people who cite what Hoeg says and takes it slightly out of context, almost like a prophet of sorts, like that. Because like I said, there are some funny comments I get at times. Like it's funny because I talked about clickbait at the beginning. You're like, oh, it wasn't clickbait. The amount of comments I saw, they were like, oh, Hoeg said it wasn't clickbait. I was like, oh, like. I feel the same way when I see a Hoeg comment. I'm like, that's probably right. Like I'm not gonna argue.
Well, occasionally I try to make sure. It used to be early on at the start of the channel. You could Google search your name and kind of just get a feel for like what people are saying about you. And now, especially this last week, it's like, oh, I don't know how much of this I should correct. I don't want to be in the business of correcting people. And jumping in, or like people knowing if I don't jump in, it's right. Like there's a whole bunch of things. Right. You need a rule book for some of this stuff. I was like, that's not quite what I said. I got a call to get on. I'll forget it.
You use your platform to correct.
Yes, sir.
That's my advice I give you.
I've been hearing people saying some stuff on the Reddits. Let's talk about that.
That's how I do it. I heard them talking spicy on Twitter.
Longer. My thoughts.
Exactly.
Anyway, we appreciate you and everyone again. Check out Hoeg Law over on YouTube if you have yet to. Thank you again, Hoeg. Thank you, Cog. And we hope you all enjoyed episode 96 of Defining Duke Ultimate, a Defining Duke supplement. And we'll catch you next week for episode 97. Until then, take great care of yourselves. Yeah, I know. 100? We're on 100 for our main episode, so that's pretty cool. But we'll catch you for episode 97 next week. Peace out.
Peace.
Defining Duke, an Xbox podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Colin's Last Stand LLC, and is recorded from the United States of America. The show is conceived by Matthew Mr. Matty Plays Schroeder and me, Colin Moriarty, and is written and produced by Matthew Schroeder. Matty's co-host is Barry Lord Cognito Eversley. Defining Duke's executive producer is Dustin Furman, and the show is edited by associate producer Ben Smith. All of Last Stand's theme music is by Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand Media's shows, including Defining Duke, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. The following names are at the producer support level on Patreon, and we're thankful for your kindness and generosity.